Welcome to the Fire These Times, the podcast bringing you conversations at the intersection of politics, culture, and the environment. I am your host, Joey Ayoub, and today we'll be talking to Kuhnhenn and Linda Schneider. They recently co-wrote a really important and freely available study exploring a societal transformation scenario, or STS, on how to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. I'm going to read to you a bit of the abstract of that paper. To stop climate change, we have to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But can we still achieve this target? And if so, what pathways can society take in transiting towards a climate-just economy? The IPCC, that is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, says in its special report that we need to reach net zero global emissions by 2050. One important problem with this and other scenario is that virtually all rely on continued global economic growth. So this study realized the importance of broadening the discussion's perspective and considering societal pathways that are currently not included in either the IPCC reports or the public debate. So they developed this STS, the Societal Transformation Scenario. It's a global climate mitigation scenario that explores the climate effects of limiting global production and consumptions and of envisioning a broader societal transformation to accompany these transformations to reach a good life for all. So I'll stop on that. All I'll say as a sort of a preface to this conversation is that we definitely discussed a lot of themes here. And I'm going to try with future episodes to go through some of them to have more in-depth conversations into each of these themes. I hope that this is not too much of an opaque conversation if you're not from a scientific background. I don't think it is. I don't have much of a scientific background. I was able to understand the gist of most of these things, and I do hope that this will be the case for yourself as well. If that is not the case, I would be very curious to hear from you as a sort of feedback so that I can take that into consideration for future episodes. So that's today's episode. This episode was first published for monthly Patreon supporters. To become a monthly Patreon supporter, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes or check their website for other methods. If you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music of this podcast is by Torabit. Thank you for listening and take care.
My name is Kuhnhenn. I work for the Konzeptwerk Neue Ökonomie. It's an NGO in Leipzig. It translates roughly to Laboratory for New Economic Ideas. And before that, I've been working for the Federal Environment Agency in Germany for 8 years on mitigation scenarios and climate policy.
So my name is Linda Schneider. I currently work with the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Berlin, which is a political foundation associated with the German Green Party. And I'm also active in the climate movement and in the Right to the City movement in Berlin.
Awesome. So thanks to you both for talking to me about this. We'll be talking primarily on a study that you two were co-authors on called A Societal Transformation Scenario for Staying Below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is 34 Fahrenheit to our American listeners. I had to Google that first. Can we start by just presenting the general arguments of the study? What is it about and why did you feel the need to write it? What does it do essentially?
So I think we can say that this study is a sort of a follow-up project on an earlier study that we did together, where we looked at assumptions of economic growth in all of the climate mitigation scenarios that the IPCC looks at in its reports, and we found that all of them rely on economic growth until the end of the century, which is the time horizon that they model. So they might even continue to rely on economic growth after that, but that we don't know. And one of the implications that has that reliance on economic growth across all world regions and until the end of time, basically, is that those scenarios have to rely on technological fixes, like technologies that then take out CO2 from the atmosphere, store it underground or in the oceans, or rely on some sort of other geoengineering technology that is really very risky and dangerous. So we realized that it's, and obviously in the degrowth movement and in other social movements, people have realized decades ago that obviously with a different economic system, with less economic growth and resource consumption, energy consumption, there could be quite different visions of a future where we could, reduce emissions much more drastically without relying on those technological quick fixes. So, but none of that existed in any sort of mainstream climate scenario, mitigation scenario. So we realized that it would be good to produce that kind of scenario, at least start thinking in those directions, exploring some of the ways in which we could, in the global north, reduce energy and resource consumption in a way that reduce emissions much more drastically. And we felt it was important to produce such a scenario.
One thing I want to say that when we decided we make a scenario where we don't focus on geoengineering options or negative emission technologies, but on reduction of consumption and production, then this opens this whole can of worms, because people assume then that this is what you model is a dystopian future. So then that is why we have this chapter on sketches of a different tomorrow, because then you have to explain the whole thinking of post-growth thinking and alternative pathways to economic growth. So that's also why it has become a study of 100 pages and not maybe 50.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm myself increasingly getting involved with various like degrowth movement stuff, although at kind of just low level, just thinking about it. Maybe I'm going to start writing about it at some point. One thing that I didn't fully comprehend about the IPCC studies is that they quote virtually all rely on continuing global economic growth until 2100, as Linda mentioned earlier. Given the rate that we are currently effectively destroying the natural living world, it really seems obvious to me, as someone who is not in the IPCC, I suppose, that this is extremely reckless, that this is at least not very responsible. Other than the politics of why this was the conclusion or why this was the assumption, I guess we might, just say, well, they had to find a way to make it appealing to global governments who won't accept anything else, et cetera, et cetera. Sure, that I guess that's the case. But I wanted to read a small paragraph from the study and ask you to comment on it, basically just to explain it, because I feel it says a lot in a few sentences. So I'm quoting here. However, in both the models and the real world, unabated economic growth is difficult to reconcile with ambitious climate goals, certainly when currently considering the closing window still left for limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The consequence of adhering to the growth paradigm is that mitigation scenarios have to rely on high-risk technologies such as geoengineering, CCS, and nuclear energy, you both just mentioned that as well, to reach mitigation goals. In many cases, such scenarios even assume the temperature will, quote, overshoot the 1.5 degrees Celsius, and please explain what that means, goal, at least temporarily, with unknown consequence for humans and ecosystems, and at the risk of hitting irreversible tipping points in the climate system during that overshoot period, end quote. So there's a number of terms here. I had Dr. Peter Kalmus on a couple of months ago, and we did talk about some of them. But if that's okay, can you sort of explain this paragraph and sort of the topic around it? For like, there are key terms, like for example, tipping point is something that I think is understood in the popular imagination, kind of like this apocalyptic zombie scenario, essentially, but not really understood in terms of what it might actually do from it, like in terms of climate change itself, and what are certain things that we can do right now. Or I feel like I'm already asking the entire study basically with the initial question, and we'll try and get into the weeds of it in a sense. But yeah, can you sort of just explain this paragraph and we just start from there?
Maybe I can start with the IPCC scenarios, or the scenarios quoted in the IPCC reports, all relying on economic growth. Yeah, this is something that I get into in the study that I did 2018. So if you're interested in this, or you listeners, that's a good resource. Yeah, basically in there, it's kind of hard to figure out, because you have to go through all these different journal articles to really find the figures. It's not very clear or obvious in the reports of the IPCC itself. But if you do that, then you find out that all the scenarios that the IPCC shows have per capita growth rates of 1% to 2.8%. And that might seem low, but that means that if you look at this over 80 years, from 2020 to 2100, it means that our economic output would double or if you take that's supposed to be 1% growth, or increase sevenfold, and that would be 2.5%. And that means like we produce twice as much, basically, and we consume twice as much as we do today, which I find very hard to comprehend. And of course, then you might ask, why is that so? And I think there's a number of reasons. There's also something I try to go into in this study I mentioned before. One thing is that it's basically engineers and economists who do these things, and they have a certain mindset, and they come from mainstream economics. That's one thing. Then who would be interested in a scenario where the economy does not grow, and who would give money for that is also an issue. But then there's also the models, which have a very hard time to actually model these kind of scenarios, because they are optimizing, and what they are trying to optimize is you give them a certain climate mitigation target, and then they find out how to reach that with the most consumption per person possible. That is kind of, and then they say this is the perfect or the optimal scenario, because it allows to stay within, I don't know, 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, while we consume as much as possible. So this is they have like a very strange logic to them. That's the thing about the scenarios, all including economic growth.
Yeah, so I would definitely agree that there's reasons for this adherence to economic growth on on many different levels. The mainstream of economic thinking, what is hegemonic in that thinking, is obviously economic growth and securing of profits. That's just the way capitalism runs, and that's true on on like a cultural hegemonic plane. Like that is the narrative, that's the story in all of the international institutions, the way mainstream climate economics work, how these scenarios are being produced. But it's also obviously very true in the real world. Like we've been, or the world has been, more or less trying to do mitigation, or to reduce emissions for several decades now, but all the way been trying to reconcile that with economic growth, with securing profits of the fossil fuel industry and of other industries that are obviously polluting and destroying livelihoods and ecosystems and the rest of it. So that's I think that's a very fundamental problem that we're running into if we're continuing within a world, within a global capitalist economy, that we're just not able to pursue these more ambitious climate goals, or that we can't really address any of the other global crises either. It's it's not just a climate crisis, but also huge biodiversity loss, global inequality, poverty, hunger, and all of that. And it just doesn't seem to be possible to address those crises if we're pursuing economic growth at those rates.
And so how does the societal transformation scenario, or I'll just call it as STS as you call it in the study, how does it differ in maybe some key ways from these growth, or the models that assume growth at all costs, essentially?
Yeah, so basically the study that we did, the scenario, doesn't even work with those economic indicators, right? It doesn't, the scenario works without costs or economic those economic factors. We're just looking at sort of absolute physical numbers here. We're looking at we're exploring in certain sectors, we're exploring ways of reducing energy and resource consumption, and that way we're bringing down emissions a lot more drastically than is possible in those scenarios that adhere to economic growth and that bet on some sort of decoupling at some point. And by decoupling, I mean decoupling emissions, or decoupling economic activity and economic growth from the rise of emissions and of the rise from the rise of consumption of resources.
If it might sound maybe counterintuitive to some listeners, How do we explain basically the fears that they may have in terms of, as you kind of mentioned before, I think, Kai, the caricature of degrowth essentially, or whatever's around it, as apocalyptic, or as wanting to go hungry and wanting to whatever. How do you go about contradicting that essentially and explaining why that is not what we're talking about?
First up, it's very important to say when we talk about degrowth or less consumption and production, we talk about the global north and not the global south. It's a concept for the global north, although there are also people in the global south who believe in it. But in the global north, there's still this idea. I mean, it's a global idea that the more material consumption, the better people are off. And this is something that is not true for the global north anymore. If you look at indicators, degrowth people would argue that not only does material growth or growth in GDP not longer create more wealth or more well-being, but it's actually taking away from our well-being, because we are sacrificing so much for our strive in our search for more economic growth. We like. If you look at humans and what they need, then of course they need a certain amount of material things. But then, well-being is multidimensional. You need freedom. You need leisure time. You need creativity. You need security. All these things, and these are all things that we sacrifice in our search for more economic growth. So we would say that, yes, you might have less material things, but you might also have less stress, less working time, less environmental destruction, less inequality, and more freedom.
I would also add that it's quite, there's a lot of ideology involved in this fight against the degrowth narrative as well, by saying, well, degrowth is going to lead us to this dystopian, we all go hungry future, and we, sort of the flip side of this narrative is we're all benefiting from economic growth. While that is not at all true. Social and economic inequality is on the rise pretty much everywhere, and it's a very small subset of people, the top percent of the global population that are actually benefiting from economic growth and from the profits that are being made in this. So I think it's also a way of disencouraging that sort of change by painting those really bleak pictures of what would happen if we were to stop capital accumulation and economic growth.
Yeah, thanks for that. And sort of around similar lines, we often hear the debate being kind of like, pro-technology versus Luddites, essentially, like, just it's either techno-optimism all the way, or we just don't want cell phones, or it's a caricature, but like there's a lot of that I see usually being played out online, so I won't pay too much attention to it, but I think it sort of reveals wider tendencies. I know that just by a small example, I'll ask the question about the dietary habits or whatever later, but when I do mention the fact that I'm mostly vegan, I've been a vegetarian for a long time, blah, 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 there's always a sense as if I have to either justify myself. It's a bit better now, to be fair, but it used to be that for a while. I have to either justify myself or sort of answer questions like, where do you get your proteins? Or like basically that I'm doing something less than what I used to before, because in theory, my options are less. But what I found obviously is that I do more, I cook more, I find more creative solutions. And it's basically that it's not a linear black or white situation. But back to technology, you do acknowledge that it's inevitable that there will be some role to play of technology in these scenarios. And that makes sense to me. I'm not an expert, but it makes sense to me. But would you mind sort of fleshing out a bit the problems with let's call it Silicon Valley friendly, techno-optimistic solution. Like Kai, you mentioned that these reports tend to be from economists and or engineers or both. It very rarely takes into account all of the other ways of just being human and thinking about things and so on. So would you mind just fleshing out this a bit more, like the problems with that kind of thinking?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that if you look at the remaining emission budget and our current emissions and how fast we have to reduce emissions, then it's very obvious that we need all the right technologies, and they need them fast. And for that, I mean, all possible efficiency measures and of course renewable energies. And these things have to be ramped up, and they have to be ramped up fast. Otherwise, we will not be able to meet the limits, the warming limits. But of course, that's very different. I mean, that's very different than saying we can just have technology fix all these things, and that is of course a very Silicon Valley approach where you have people saying, yeah, basically what we need is a second planet where we put all the rubbish or stuff like this, or even people talking about singularity, which like having this, we just have to like there's also these people, this movement called accelerists, which say, okay, we just have to have this technology development, have it very fast so that we reach a point where we have this artificial intelligence, and it will be able to improve itself all the time, and that will solve our solutions. And that just makes me, first of all, what are the environmental costs of this, which are usually not talked about, and secondly, what kind of idea do you have of a democratic, free, open society, and what do you actually want? And I think these are very strange ideas, and I think there's much better ways to live together, and I also believe much more in people working together and coming up with solutions together. I feel like these people who have these opinions, they have a very low opinion of humans usually.
Yeah, it's definitely a very cynical take in general.
So yeah, in the scenario, we, as Kai said, we assume very ambitious expansion of renewables and also of efficiency measures. So that's very clear. We're not limiting global warming to 1.5 without renewables. That's completely clear. And we need the fastest expansion possible, obviously, and the fastest phase out of fossil fuels as possible as well. But then the question is, what sorts of technologies are we developing, and what are the social and ecological impacts of that? And maybe I can comment briefly on your question of overshoot that you had earlier. So what many of those of the more mainstream climate mitigation scenarios do is that basically they shoot through the emissions budget that we still have left. And then roughly in the second half of the century, these scenarios assume that we'll have a whole range of technologies at our disposal that will then remove CO2 from the atmosphere and store it somewhere, like store it underground, store it in products, store it in the oceans. And these technologies are usually called carbon dioxide removal technologies, and they're one subset of geoengineering technologies, so of technologies that aim at manipulating the global climate and the global Earth systems. And all of these technologies, they have to be implemented at basically planetary scale, because that's the level of operation. And they come with huge risks and negative impacts for ecosystems and particularly for the most vulnerable parts of the populations. And it's also very far from, like, none of these technologies currently exist. It's very far from clear if they'll ever exist and be effective. So we're basically betting on a techno fix for the second half of the century, for us to be able to return to 1.5. Towards the end of the century. So that's the concept of overshoot. We're shooting through the budget, we're going above 1.5, but then we're implementing all of these, dangerous technologies to return to 1.5. And another idea in this whole geoengineering universe is a concept called solar radiation management, where, for example, you would shoot particles into the stratosphere that would then reflect incoming sunlight back to space. So that will be a way, hypothetically, a way of simply suppressing temperature rise. So you do nothing about the causes, you don't address the root causes of the crisis, but you're just suppressing temperature. And that way, sort of on paper, you've returned to 1.5 and you've met the climate goal, which is obviously not, I think, what anyone means by limiting global warming to 1.5 and actually addressing the crisis. And as you mentioned, the problem of tipping points, in the climate system, like the collapse of ice sheets, for example, or the melting of permafrost, where there's loads of methane stored, in frozen form, and if that melts and gets released, then that will accelerate global warming and lead to more global warming, and then you hit the next tipping point, and so on and so forth. So there's a number of such tipping points in the climate system, and then that's basically a self-accelerating dynamic that you hit. And I think that's also something that this kind of very mechanical thinking, or this very mechanical approach to the climate system and to the problem of climate change and the climate crisis doesn't really fully acknowledge in a way, because the approach of stuff like geoengineering is, you push a button, or you just remove CO2, you just put it somewhere else, problem solved. And that's not really how things work. The climate system is not, it's not a machine, it's not a linear thing, it's a very complex set of systems that are interrelated. And once you've hit tipping points that can be irreversible or just reversible or over a very, very long time span, so nothing that you can just reverse within a decade or two by just pushing some buttons. And and these technologies also, of course, as you can imagine, the fossil fuel industry and another industry, the tech industry as well, Silicon Valley was mentioned, they have a tremendous interest in this kind of technology, because obviously it would allow them to continue business as usual, because you get the false impression of having a techno fix at hand that will just solve the problem for you, rather than addressing the actual causes and implementing structural change and embarking on an actual societal transformation that we need, also given that we're facing multiple other crises as well globally.
Maybe I can just add about the overshoot. Why do these scenarios overshoot in the first place? Because why don't they employ all these technological options in 2030 or 2035, and then we don't have this overshoot? And then the one of the reasons for that is that all these models, they have these discount rates in them. It's basically saying, since the economy is growing all the time, it will be much cheaper to reduce emissions in the future, to invest in these things in the future, because we have so much more money and technology will be cheaper. And that is one of these assumptions, which is like an ethical considerations, which are deeply rooted in these models, and which I find which I'm very skeptical about, because it basically shifts the burden to the future. And because we just assume that the economy will continue to grow, and I know that I find it's one of the flaws of these models as well.
Yeah, somehow just reminded me of when we speak of the 3 R's, like reduce, reuse, recycle. A lot of the time we tend to focus on the last one, recycle, when it's actually the first 2 that would obviously make the most impact. And even from school, like, it's something that I just remember as, because there is a psychological sense of psychological component of, like, well, you're doing something, and therefore it feels like it has more impact than in some ways not doing something, or doing less of that same something, or whatever. So there's a psychological component to it. But other than that, I mean, I personally don't know how to describe these economic ideologies other than ideologies, and in some ways like magical thinking at this point. It really requires a lot of suspension of disbelief and actively rejecting science and basic reasonable rational, I should say, conclusions to maintain these economic models and these economic priorities. And I don't even know if I should say economic. I'm kind of putting it in quotation in my head because there are obviously other ways of thinking about the study of economics, but that tends to be the dominant school of thought. And sort of on around the topic of reducing essentially degrowth and so on. I'll have a number of episodes hopefully on how that is being thought about in the global south. But as you mentioned, that tends to be something that the global north especially needs to be thinking about much faster. And so one important point in the study, in the STS, is that you assume that the global north will have to reduce, obviously, like polluting factors, such as, I have some written down, like transport, housing, and food. For example, there must be a reduction in food waste and meat consumption, as well as a shift from road-based transport aided by a relocalization of economies and better local infrastructure. For the global south, however, you assume, quote, an increase in consumption levels leading to convergence of consumption patterns of the global south with those of the global north in 2050, end quote. You did touch upon it a bit, but would you mind just explaining the reasoning here a bit more? And the three of us live in the global north. What will have to be done in the global north to minimize social hardships associated with these reductions in your view?
Can I start with the first question? Yeah. What we also have like a whole box about this in the study, because we find it's quite a dilemma for a group who is white and from the global north to make a global scenario and then have to make some assumptions for the global south. Because that is a very long and bad history of colonial thinking, and the North having some idea of how the South has to, in quotation marks, develop. At the same time, we don't get around this because we want to do a global scenario. So what we did was that we assumed that the consumption parameters do not go down in the global South, but they rise and they come to the same point as the consumption in the global north in 2050. And in some cases, they're even higher. For example, flying. We allow for people in the global south to fly more than in the global north in 2050. And we understand that this can be criticized. It can be criticized from people who say, but why do you have these restrictions on our consumptions? Why can we not consume how the global north consumed in 2020, for example? That is one direction, and then there's the other one that might still see this as this idea that the global south needs to, in quotation marks, develop and is, in quotation marks, underdeveloped, and that we do not see this other path for the global south. And I think these are, the second one is a more valid, well, I think both are valid criticism, but I don't think we had to find some middle way for that. Yeah. So that's for your first question.
So I guess in the scenario, we're just starting from the assumption that the global north has the biggest responsibility, historically speaking, and currently for producing the crisis, for having emitted so much that we're in the mess that we're in right now, and that the global north, the way that production and consumption works, is that what is being consumed in the global north also embodies a whole lot of resources from other parts of the world, in the form of land and water and other resources. So we started from the assumption that needs to decrease. We need to decrease to lead meaningful lives. So perhaps to give you one example is the sector of mobility. So in the scenario, we're reducing road-based transport, and in particular individualized, so road-based transport, like driving around in your car the whole time and taking planes everywhere you go because it's so cheap. So in the scenario, for example, the number of flights per person goes down to 1 every 3 years in the global north. But then you also have to look at the fact that for in 2018, for example, only 4% of the global population, boarded an international flight. So it's not like those numbers are actually going down for everyone in the global north. It's actually going up for some, or for many probably, because it's such a small number of people that, that's even using the option of taking an airplane. But then obviously in the scenario, other modes of transportation, more communal modes of transportation, rail-based transportation, obviously all of that goes up. It's not about, limiting people's mobility. That's not the point, but, reducing ways of transport that are very harmful in terms of their emissions profiles, and also the amount of resources that consume. So yeah, if you look at it in the end, I don't think people's mobility will necessarily be constrained in a way. You can still move around. You'll just take the train or the bus, and not a plane or your private car. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. It is something that it really bothers me how easy it is to take planes in Europe to travel to very close areas in Europe as well. This is something that does bother me a lot. I personally mostly just take trains. In America as well, it's pretty bad as well. It's something that I have, I'm from Lebanon, so I have a few friends that are starting to try and think about what this might look like in like degrowth, for example, in a context like Lebanon. And like, long story short, it's extremely difficult. It's there's no real Lebanon is barely developing in the first place for them to start thinking about degrowth, for example. So there are limitations to these models, and that's why I appreciate that you mentioned prioritizing the global north. That being said, I do think there will have to be, countries like China and Brazil are two obvious examples that will have to also think about some of these things. And there are environmentalists, to be fair, from these countries that are trying to think about these things as well. I'll try and have some of them on at some point. But just a bit more on the technical side, the STS that you worked on was developed on the basis of the Global Calculator, GC. Can you just explain what that is for those who may not know? I didn't know before reading either.
Yeah, I mean, it's this tool. It's actually web-based, but we actually used the spreadsheet that you can download and adapted it to our needs. It's a rather simple tool. It's mathematically speaking, there's a lot of data in it, of course, but basically what it does is that you give it some kind of, let's say you tell it that there will be this certain demand of transport, and this demand will be met by a certain modal split, and modal split means how the share of different of cars, trains, walking, biking, and then you also have to tell it how efficient are these things, how efficient is your car, your train, how many people are on this train, on the car in general, and then it calculates the energy demand, and then you have to tell it what will be the energy mix, and from the energy demand, it can then calculate the CO2 emissions. So it's basically just multiplications. And this is what we used. And so what that means is that there's no optimization from the model. Everything that happens in the model, the user has to put in there. And it's much simpler than these integrated assessment models, and it can be used. I mean, it can be used by everyone who puts his mind to it, I'd say. And it's open source. And in the end, I think it's just a much better tool to have this open discussion about scenarios and what world we want to live in, and not just what technologies we want to use and how much they might cost. But yeah, it's not perfect, but I think it's a step in the right direction, and I think it's definitely. I think we definitely need to move away from these integrated assessment models.
Yeah, maybe just to add, so the way global mitigation scenarios are usually produced is with the help of those integrated assessment models. They're very, very complex models that are being run by a fairly small amount of people, just research teams in different parts of the world, obviously, but it's a fairly small number of underlying models there, and they have a they have a whole host of very complex algorithms, and you give them certain socioeconomic inputs in the beginning, but then sort of the model applies its algorithms, and you get a result in the end. But they're very difficult to comprehend for anyone outside of this modeling community. They're very intransparent, and it's very difficult. It's very difficult to understand what the initial assumptions were in a way. And then you get a certain result like, we need to be at net zero in 2050, for example. But then there's no way really of knowing. I mean, there is a way of knowing if you go deep into, the technical explanation of the scenario. It's not like it's a complete secret, but it's very difficult for the broader public to understand how a scenario got to a certain result and what it implies, and what net zero implies also. Net zero being this concept of, it's not actual zero, it's not real zero, but it's net zero. So you will still, at this point of net zero, you will still have a certain amount of emissions from different sectors, but then you will have so-called negative emissions through sinks or through geoengineering that will then compensate and offset those emissions, and that can be at various levels and degrees. So that's very important, the extent to which you rely on those so-called negative emissions. So it's really the devil's in the detail, and it definitely merits closer inspection and consideration of what those results imply for societies, for economies. So we found it important to use, apart from the fact that we, couldn't even have used such an IAM because we don't have one, we found it very important to use a model that is kind of more transparent, that can be that could be rerun by other people in a way, and that just allows for, as Kai said, for more potentially for a more democratic debate. And that's in a way, that's also what we've been getting. Like people can criticize the assumptions we're making. We say, well, people in the global north will only fly once every 3 years, and then people can criticize that, and we can say, well, if that's not the option you like, then let's discuss what else we'll do to reduce emissions and consumption. We can, there's obviously millions of potential pathways. It doesn't have to be that, but then what are we going to do? We need to do something. So
For me, I admit I have difficulties with the concept of net zero in the first place, and a lot of the negative consumption. What was the term? Sorry, like negative whatever.
Negative emissions.
Negative emissions just feels a bit of like double speak sometimes, to be honest. It does, and as a sort of an anecdote, or for those who don't know, like the pipeline, the Keystone pipeline, hopefully will be cancelled, although there's still an aspect of it that may still go through. And one of the ways that the Alberta government in Canada is trying to convince the Biden administration, which supposedly wants to veto it. We don't really know what's going to happen on that front yet, so I'm not going to claim anything. But one of the ways that they're trying to sort of make their case is by saying, well, the construction of the pipeline will be net zero, and that they will only use union labor, sorry. And that shows to me that like when they want to, they can find very creative ways of avoiding the problem, or avoiding what, like, just instead of, because obviously the solution here would be to not build the pipeline. And this, given that they don't want that, they will find a dozen ways around it. And I feel like this sort of language of net zero, which, like, I'm not an expert, so I'm not gonna throw it away completely. I'm not that confident on that, but it does seem to be, to put it mildly, misused a lot of the time. And it's very sorry, it's just very problematic, and it's something that I just feel like a lot can be like a lot of politicians and corporations can get away with a lot of things by framing things this way. And it does seem to be working, unfortunately, with a lot of people, probably because it sounds better than what it actually is. But as you say, like, the devil is in the detail. Around that same topic, at the end of the FAQ, You write, and I quote, "The STS is an invitation for debate around climate mitigation, the role of production and consumption, and deeper societal transformation." And then you ask, what are the questions that should emerge from this in the scientific community and in broader society? So we already went through some of them, but if in case I missed any of the questions that you feel, for example, listeners should be asking themselves, what are some of them?
I hope that people see our study and then they might agree or they might get upset, but they come to the right questions. And the question, I think, is not which technologies should we use to get emissions from the atmosphere, or is it cheaper to do things now or later, but the question should be, how do we want to live in the future, and how do we want to move, how do we want to what do we want to eat, how do we want to produce what we eat, and these things, I think, are what we need to talk about and come to an understanding what that means.
Yeah, I think so. For the scientific community, I think our objective was to really just broaden the space of what's considered feasible mitigation scenarios, because the way that this space is constructed right now, it really shapes our understanding of what is possible and what isn't. So if all of those scenarios rely on economic growth and come to certain, and then rely on so-called negative emissions technologies, those geoengineering technologies that I mentioned earlier, then obviously what people, civil society, but also the media, policymakers, people across different constituencies, what they take away from it is we can only, either 1.5 isn't possible anymore, or we can only achieve it while relying on geoengineering. Like, we need geoengineering to limit global warming to 1.5, and that's just it's not true, but it's a consequence of the way the models are being run right now. So it's a consequence of the limited space that's being created there. So we need to broaden that space and realize that there are many more ways of going about the problem and addressing the problem that do not rely on techno fixes, and that explore alternative pathways to address the crisis. That's what I would say was our goal for, or should be the goal for, the scientific community. And obviously others should jump in and produce more ambitious scenarios as well. And I guess for the broader public or society, I think it goes back to what you said in the beginning. Like, we're just destroying the natural world, we're destroying ecosystems, livelihoods, really just the life supporting systems that we all run on. We're just destroying that at accelerating pace, and we need to come to terms with that, and just not kick the can down the road and continue doing that. But we need to face the crisis that we're facing, and we need to talk about the ways in which we can transform societies and economies to face that crisis. We can't just continue to rely on economic growth and on techno fixes and on and all of that.
Maybe one thing I would like to add, because I forgot, and I think it's very close dear to my heart, is that I hope that people realize when reading the study, or get this idea, that we have all these different crises. We have inequality, we have racism, we have classism, we have people who get depressed everywhere and stuff like this. And I hope that people realize these are all different problems, and they're connected, by certain economic structures and the way we do business, for example. And we should not try to solve them one by one. We should try to come up with solutions that benefit people who are poor, but also benefit the environment, for example, because otherwise these solutions would just be played against each other, which we already see today.
Yeah, thanks for that. And like on the topic of depression, a big part, like while reading the study, I didn't finish most of it, but I tend to be reading quite a lot of these days, a lot of literature at least on climate change and just following the activist movement. And as I mentioned, a bit more into degrowth and other things. One, I think a term that's becoming a bit more understood in recent years, although not as much yet, is like the concept of climate grief or climate anxiety. And I feel like this is something that many people who think about climate change will inevitably start thinking about it. But I would only assume that, people like you who work on climate change or around climate change more directly, it's just something that inevitably pops up. So if like maybe this is more of a personal question, and just feel free to answer however you feel most comfortable. But how do you deal with it yourselves?
Well, I think in general I have like a positive disposition, so I try to look at what happens, all the positive things that happen, and but I also try to stay away from certain media because I don't need to hear these things all the time. But I would also suggest that working on it is probably the best idea. Like working, especially being active in social movements is probably the best thing, because that's, first of all, you can share your pain there, but you can also feel that you can actually do something about it and feel powerful, and not feel powerless, because that I think adds a lot to the anxiety. And I also would say that being an activist is fun.
Yeah, I guess for me it's very similar. The way that I deal with it is definitely, being part of the climate movement, organized with people that, with whom I share a lot of the sentiments and political goals. And yeah, it would definitely frustrate me a lot more if I was just to sit at my desk, which I do already enough, but just sit at my desk and read those frustrating news. And yeah, it can definitely be very it can definitely create a lot of anxiety if you think about this impending crisis all of the time. At the same time, I'm also like, you probably know better if you've looked into that concept a bit more. If that's also something that has to do with where you're positioned in a way, like people in the global north tend to think about the climate crisis a lot in the way of this impending crisis on the horizon that will one gloomy day will come. While in other parts of the world, that crisis has been there for a long time, and it's just not just, but is also an exacerbation of other crises, and that is being felt already in very different ways. And even in the global north, the climate crisis will not just come as this one event, but it will be a slow onset process and will come in very different forms. So yeah, but yeah, I definitely agree with what Kai said earlier. I think it also helps to look at the fact that we're not just facing a climate crisis, in the context of this climate crisis and of growing social inequality, for example, we're also facing the rise of fascism all across the world. So it's not just about, it's a hugely important fight against the climate crisis or addressing that crisis, but there are also other crises that are connected with this, where I think even if there's a certain degree of climate change that we won't be able to prevent anymore, we can still fight for ways of dealing with this crisis that that do not exacerbate other crises, or that do not that also address social inequality, for example, and that can help sort of all of us live in this and with this crisis in a way that's a lot better than under very authoritarian and conditions of huge inequality and so on.
Yeah, I would only add by saying that everything. I agree with everything that you two just said, and in addition to that, there is a sizable percentage of modern fascism that is actually trying to appropriate the ecological movement, what we might call ecofascism. Although I know that term sometimes is used by conservatives to attack actual environmentalists, but there is a term called ecofascism. It is a political phenomenon. And they can easily frame things like, a Nazi or neo-Nazi version of the link up the purity of the race with the purity of nature, and focus a bit too much, quote unquote, too much on overpopulation elsewhere and that sort of thing. This does happen quite a lot. I will also say, as someone who thinks more about media from a cultural criticism perspective or whatever, the notions of these techno fixes being failures of the imagination is something that's just very common in movies in general and TV series. I can only think of that very bad movie, what was it, 2012, I think, and the Day After Tomorrow and that sort of thing, where you just have this massive thing that happens over a couple of days, and then we have found the light after that, and we decide, well, Mother Nature has taught us a lesson, and now we need to grow up with something, or whatever it is. And it's the same scenario. It's because it comes from the same, historically, from the same timeline, essentially, as an alien invasion or a foreign invasion or a zombie invasion or whatever it is, and it kind of follows the same storyline, and which is why obviously it doesn't work, because as you two said very well, this is not a linear problem. This is a network problem. This is a lot of interconnected factors play into this, and we obviously just scratched the surface into all of this. But part of why I'm doing these episodes is to scratch a little more one at a time. And so I'll ask you the sort of the final question I'm asking guests now, which is, as part of the scratching the surface a bit more, or broadening our imagination, trying to think about different things and whatnot, can you recommend 3 books to listeners, whether directly related or indirectly related, doesn't really matter, that you have found interesting and powerful and that you would like to share?
Yeah, I don't read a lot of non-fiction actually, and I don't read a lot about the climate crisis or anything, so I cannot give you anything that's very close to our study or anything. But one book that I find quite inspiring is The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin. It's about an anarchistic society on the moon, which I think is very good. And then there's a book that has been read a lot in my organization. It's called Emergent Strategies by Adrienne Maree Brown, and everyone who has read it is quite excited about it. I haven't, but I guess it's quite good. And then I thought The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck is a book that I found quite impactful when I read it, and I think it's full of very, very true things. So these are my 3.
I also really liked The Dispossessed, I have to say. I think I read it last year or the year before. I would just add perhaps one book, which is a book that I read recently by Andreas Malm, called Corona, Climate and Chronic Emergency, War, Communism in the 21st Century. I really like the book. I can only recommend it to anyone interested in the climate crisis, also the corona pandemic, and it's analytically speaking, I think it's a very powerful book. So I can only recommend it to people.
Awesome. Well, to the both of you, thank you a lot for your time. This has been really informative. I think listeners will agree. And I will link up, for as much as I can remember, everything that we just mentioned on the blog post, and obviously the study itself, I will link up in the blog post as well. So yeah, thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Welcome. Thanks.
The Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. And if you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.